The Queen of Mystery's greatest mystery, Agatha Christie's disappearance. On December 3rd, 1926, the most famous mystery writer in the world vanished without a trace. Agatha Christie, creator of Hercule Poirot, master of the murder mystery, the woman who'd built her career on solving impossible crimes, simply disappeared into the night. Her car was found abandoned at the edge of a quarry, headlights still on, the front wheels hanging over the edge as if she'd been about to drive off a cliff. Inside the car were her fur coat and a small suitcase. No body, no note, no explanation. Over 1,000 police officers searched the English countryside. Bloodhounds tracked her scent to a nearby pond and then lost it. The Home Secretary got involved. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, creator of Sherlock Holmes, consulted a psychic and gave her one of Agatha's gloves to hold, hoping for supernatural guidance. 15,000 volunteers combed through the woods and fields. Airplanes flew search patterns overhead. And then, 11 days later, Agatha Christie was found alive and well at a luxury spa hotel at Harrogate, playing the piano in the lounge, taking tea with other guests, and attending dances in the evening. She'd checked into the hotel under a false name, specifically the name of her husband's mistress. She claimed she remembered nothing. Total amnesia, and for the rest of her life, through decades of fame, through hundreds of interviews, through her autobiography written years later, she never explained what happened during those 11 days. The Queen of Mystery created her own greatest mystery and then took the solution to her grave. Tonight, we're diving into the life of Agatha Christie and the disappearance that shocked England, the toxic marriage that preceded it, the theories that emerged, and why a woman who spent her life crafting perfect explanations for impossible crimes left her own story unsolved. Light your candles, get comfortable, and let's unravel the mystery that even Hercule Poirot couldn't solve. Agatha Mary Clarissa Miller was born in 1890 in Torquay, a seaside town in Devon, England. She was the youngest of three children in a comfortably upper middle class family, the kind of family where you had servants but still worried about money, where property mattered more than wealth. Her childhood was unusual for the time. Her mother, Clara, was eccentric and believed that children shouldn't learn to read until they were 8 years old because it was bad for the brain. Young Agatha, naturally stubborn, taught herself to read by age 5 anyway. Her mother then decided formal education was unnecessary and kept her home, letting her run semi-wild through their property, reading voraciously and developing an intense imagination. Agatha was shy, dreamy, and prone to creating elaborate fantasy worlds. She'd spend hours alone inventing characters and stories in her head. Her sister, Madge, 10 years older, was a gifted writer who published stories and plays. When young Agatha tried writing her own story, Madge apparently told her, "I bet you can't write a good detective story." It was the kind of casual sibling challenge that accidentally shaped literary history. Her father died when she was 11, and the family's financial situation became precarious. They had to economize, which in Edwardian terms meant having fewer servants and worrying about maintaining their social standing. For a teenage girl whose entire identity was wrapped in being a gentlewoman, this was mortifying. At 16, Agatha was sent to a finishing school in Paris to learn the skills expected of a proper young lady: singing, piano, dancing, and how to catch a husband. She was actually a gifted pianist and seriously considered pursuing music professionally, but crippling stage fright made performance impossible. Years later, she'd write that performing in public made her physically ill, but writing, where she could hide behind her characters, felt safe. She returned to England and entered the social circuit, attending dances and parties where eligible young women were essentially on display for eligible young men. She hated it. She was pretty enough, tall with reddish blonde hair and striking eyes, but painfully shy and terrible at flirting. She wrote later that she felt like a pink pudding at these events. And then she met Archibald Christie. Lieutenant Archibald Christie was everything Agatha wasn't: outgoing, confident, athletic, and utterly certain of himself. He was a pilot in the Royal Flying Corps. This was 1912, when aviation was still thrillingly new and dangerous. He was handsome, charming, and from a respectable military family. What followed was a whirlwind romance that Agatha later described as in her autobiography with a mixture of nostalgia and what reads like bewilderment at her younger self. Archie pursued her intensely. They went on chaperoned outings. He proposed after only a few months. Her mother thought it was too fast and disapproved. Agatha, the obedient daughter who'd never rebelled, suddenly became defiant. They got engaged and then immediately faced the reality that they had no money. Archie was a junior officer with minimal pay. Agatha had no income at all, but they were young and in love and convinced that everything would work out. Then World War One broke out in 1914, and Archie was sent to France as a pilot. They married quickly in December 1914 in a sparse ceremony with few guests because most of their friends and family were dealing with the war. Agatha wore a second-hand dress. They had barely any honeymoon before Archie had to report for duty. This set the pattern for their marriage: long separations, brief intense reunions, and Agatha waiting endlessly for letters that might or might not arrive. During the war, Agatha volunteered as a nurse, working in a hospital in Torquay. She started in the wards, doing the brutal work of caring for wounded soldiers, changing dressings, cleaning infected wounds, comforting dying men. Later, she transferred to the pharmacy dispensary, where she learned about drugs and poisons. This would prove extremely useful for her future career. She later wrote, "Working in a hospital dispensary during the war was really what set me off on the path of detective fiction. She learned about morphine, strychnine, arsenic, digitalis, all the exotic poisons that would feature in her novels. She learned about dosages, symptoms, and how different substances could be disguised or detected. She became genuinely knowledgeable, which is why her murder methods are often so realistic. During these war years, still waiting for Archie between his dangerous missions, Agatha started writing her first detective novel. Remember that challenge from her sister about writing a good detective story? Agatha decided to actually try it. She created Hercule Poirot, a Belgian refugee detective living in England. Belgium was occupied by Germany, so Belgian refugees were everywhere in England during the World War One. It was topical. She made him fussy, methodical, obsessed with order and psychology. She gave him a brilliant mind and an enormous ego. She wrote The Mysterious Affair at Styles and submitted it to multiple publishers. It was rejected repeatedly. Finally, in 1920, after the war ended, it was published by John Lane at the Bodley Head. Agatha got £25 up front and terrible royalty terms. The publisher basically robbed her, but she was so desperate to be published that she signed anyway. The book got decent reviews. It didn't make her famous or wealthy, but it got her started. Meanwhile, her marriage was complicated. After the war ended, Archie came home and they had to figure out how to actually live together after years of separation and dramatic reunions. It wasn't easy. Archie left the Royal Flying Corps and took a job in finance in London. They moved to a flat in the city. In 1919, their daughter Rosalind was born. They should have been happy. The war was over, they had a beautiful baby, Archie had a stable job. Agatha's writing career was starting, but something was off. Archie, it turned out, was not really suited to domestic life. He was restless, bored by anything that wasn't exciting. He'd been a fighter pilot, living on adrenaline and danger. Now he was a businessman commuting to an office. He found fatherhood tedious and made no secret of it. He didn't want to spend time with baby Rosalind. He didn't want quiet evenings at home. What Archie wanted was golf and tennis and cocktail parties and anything that involved being active, social, and home and somewhere other than home with his wife and daughter. Agatha later wrote, he was a man who needed to live adventurously. Domesticity bored him. She tried to be what he wanted. She learned to play golf despite hating it. She went to parties despite her shyness. She tried to be fun and adventurous instead of bookish and introspective. It exhausted her, and it wasn't enough. But there were good moments too. In 1922, Archie was sent on a business trip to promote the British Empire exhibition, a tour that would take him around the world. And amazingly, miraculously, he invited Agatha to come with him. They left baby Rosalind with Agatha's mother and sister. This was normal for the time. Upper class parents often left children with relatives for extended periods. Then Agatha and Archie embarked on a 10-month journey around the world. This trip was one of the happiest periods of Agatha's life, and she wrote about it extensively in letters and later in her autobiography. They traveled to South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, Hawaii, and Canada. They stayed in hotels, met interesting people, attended formal dinners and receptions. And in South Africa, Agatha learned to surf. This detail delights me because it's so unexpected. Agatha Christie, the proper English lady who wrote cozy murder mysteries, learned to stand up surf in South Africa in 1922. They were actually one of the first British people who tried stand up surfing. She wrote about it with genuine joy. I learned to stand upright on a board and come into shore on the waves. It was heaven, nothing like rushing through the water at what seems like 100 miles an hour. She was good at it too. She describes the terror and exhilaration of catching a wave, the physical strength it required, the absolute freedom of being in the ocean with nothing but a board and the water. For someone who spent most of her life trapped in social expectations and her own anxiety, surfing must have felt like flying. During this trip, Agatha and Archie were happy together in a way they hadn't been in years. They were having adventures, seeing the world away from the responsibilities of home. Archie was fun and charming. Agatha was relaxed and confident. But trips end, and when they got back to England in 1923, reality was waiting. Through the mid 1920s, Agatha's writing career took off while her marriage continued to deteriorate. She published multiple books, created her other famous detective, Miss Marple, and started earning real money from her writing. By 1926, she'd published 6 novels and was becoming genuinely famous. The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, published in 1926, was a massive bestseller with a twist ending that readers either loved or felt betrayed by. She was making enough money that the family wasn't financially stressed anymore. But success didn't fix what was broken in her marriage. Archie was increasingly absent, increasingly irritable when he was home, and increasingly transparent about his contempt for domestic life. He played golf constantly, he stayed out late, he avoided spending time with Rosalind, who was now a lively 7-year-old girl who barely knew her father. Agatha threw herself into writing and caring for her mother Clara, who was elderly and in declining health. In the spring of 1926, Clara died at the family home in Torquay. Agatha was devastated. She'd been extremely close to her mother, who encouraged her imagination and writing. After the funeral, Agatha had to deal with clearing out the family home, which was full of decades of accumulated possessions and memories. It was emotionally brutal work. She asked Archie to help her, or at least to come spend time with her while she dealt with this overwhelming task. He refused. He said he couldn't take time off work. He said she should just hire someone to do it. He stayed in London and played golf. Agatha later wrote that this was when she realized her marriage was over, even if she wasn't ready to admit it yet. She was drowning in grief and exhausting work, and her husband couldn't be bothered to support her. She spent months sorting through the house alone, becoming increasingly depressed and exhausted. Her friends noticed she seemed off, distracted, emotional, not herself. And then in August 1926, Archie came to visit her in the house in Torquay. She thought maybe he'd finally come to help, to be supportive, to be present. Instead, he told her he was in love with someone else and wanted a divorce. Her name was Nancy Neele. She was younger than Agatha, only 25 to Agatha's 36. She was athletic, fun, outgoing, comfortable in social situations. She played golf. She and Archie had met through their golf club social circle. Archie announced that he'd been having an affair with Nancy and that he was in love with her. He wanted to marry her. He wanted Agatha to agree to a divorce. Agatha was shattered. She later described this moment as the worst of her life, worse than her father's death, worse than the war, worse than her mother's recent death. Everything she'd built her identity around, being a wife, being respectable, being a proper English gentlewoman, was being destroyed. And Archie, according to Agatha's account, was cold about it. He didn't apologize, he didn't express guilt or regret. He essentially said this was unfortunate, but he wanted what he wanted, and could she please be reasonable about the divorce? Agatha refused. She begged him to reconsider, to try to work on their marriage, to think about Rosalind. Archie was unmoved. He moved out of their home and went to stay with friends, friends who, it turned out, were also friends with Nancy. Over in the next few months, Agatha lived in this limbo of a dying marriage. Would occasionally come by the house for appearances' sake or to discuss practical matters. They'd argue. Agatha would cry and plead. Archie would be distant and irritable. Her friends later said she became increasingly erratic during this period. She'd break down crying unexpectedly. She'd forget things. She seemed both manic and depressed, swinging between writing furiously and being unable to function at all. On Friday, December 3rd, 1926, Archie came to the house to tell Agatha he was going away for the weekend. He was going to a house party at the home of some friends, friends who would also be hosting Nancy Neele. They had another argument. By all accounts, it was vicious. Agatha accused him of deliberately humiliating her by parading his affair publicly. Archie accused her of being melodramatic and refusing to accept reality. It escalated, and then Archie left for his weekend with Nancy. That night, Agatha Christie disappeared. At around 9:45 p.m. on Friday, December 3rd, 1926, Agatha kissed her sleeping daughter Rosalind goodnight, spoke briefly with the housemaid, got into her Morris Cowley car, and drove away from the house in Sunningdale, Berkshire. She was wearing her pearl necklace and a knitted cardigan. She'd packed a small suitcase with a few clothes. She left no note. The next morning, Saturday, December 4th, a young man found her car abandoned at Newlands Corner, a beauty spot near Guildford in Surrey, about 6 miles from her house. The car was parked at the edge of a steep chalk quarry, with the front wheels hanging over the edge as if it had been heading towards the drop. The headlights were still on, though the battery had died overnight. The car was in neutral. Inside were Agatha's fur coat, a small suitcase, and her driving license. There was no sign of a struggle. No blood, no note, just an abandoned car at the edge of a cliff, and no trace of the most famous mystery writer in England. When Archie was informed, he rushed back from his weekend party. The police were called. An immediate search began. The initial assumption was suicide. The car at the edge of the quarry suggested she'd driven off in distress and either jumped or fallen. Drivers searched the nearby Silent Pool, a deep pond that featured in the local ghost legends. They dredged it repeatedly. Nothing. Then they considered murder. Maybe someone had abducted her, forced her to drive to this location, taken her somewhere. But who and why? There was no ransom demand. There were no enemies or obvious suspects. The police questioned Archie extensively. His alibi was solid. He'd been at the house party with multiple witnesses, including Nancy Neele. But the timing was suspicious. He'd just announced he wanted a divorce. They'd had a violent argument the night she disappeared. The media immediately started suggesting he might have been involved, which Archie found both insulting and terrifying. By Monday, the story had exploded in the newspapers. Famous novelist vanishes, screamed the headlines. Mrs. Agatha Christie disappears in mysterious circumstances. The Home Secretary, William Johnson Hicks, got personally involved, which was unprecedented for a missing person case. But this wasn't just anyone, this was a famous author, and the mystery was exactly the kind of thing that captivated the public imagination. Over 1,000 police officers were assigned to search the countryside around where the car was found. They used bloodhounds, which tracked Agatha's scent from the car down to a nearby pond called the Silent Pool, then lost it. They brought it in dragnets and divers again. They searched fields, woods, abandoned buildings. 15,000 volunteers showed up to help search. People came from all over England, walking through freezing December countryside, calling Agatha's name, looking in ditches and under bushes. It became a national obsession. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, creator of Sherlock Holmes and fellow mystery writer, joined the search effort in the most bizarre way possible. He consulted a psychic medium named Horace Leaf, giving him one of Agatha's gloves and asking for supernatural guidance on where she might be. The psychic apparently had a vision of Agatha being alive, but in a dark, confined space. This was not helpful. The Daily News offered a £100 reward for information. The police held daily press conferences. Theories multiplied wildly. Some people thought she'd been murdered. Some thought she'd committed suicide and the body just hadn't been found yet. Some thought she'd had an accident and was suffering from amnesia somewhere. Some thought she'd staged the whole thing as a publicity stunt for her books. This last theory particularly enraged Agatha's family and friends, who insisted she'd never do such a thing. But the timing was suspicious. The murder of Roger Ackroyd had been published earlier that year and was a huge bestseller. A mysterious disappearance was generating massive publicity. Her books were flying off the shelves. Sales were going through the roof. Meanwhile, Archie Christie was being destroyed by media attention. Newspapers heavily implied he was involved. They described his affair with Nancy Neele, painting him as the cad who drove his wife to suicide or worse. He gave defensive interviews insisting he had nothing to do with her disappearance, which only made him look more guilty. Nancy Neele, for her part, went into hiding from the press. Days passed. A week. The search continued, but hope was fading. If Agatha had been in the countryside, surely she would have been found by now, with thousands of people looking. The weather was cold and rainy. If she was outside without proper clothing, exposure would have killed her. And then, on Tuesday, December 14th, 11 days after she'd vanished, the case broke open in the most unexpected way. The Harrogate Hydropathic Hotel was a luxury spa resort in Yorkshire, about 200 miles north of where Agatha had disappeared. It catered to wealthy guests who came for the healing waters, the spa treatments, and the genteel social atmosphere. On December 14th, the hotel's band leader, Bob Tappan, noticed something odd about one of the guests. She was a woman in her 30s who checked in on December 4th, the day after Agatha disappeared, under the name Teresa Neele. She told the hotel staff that she was a visitor from South Africa who'd come to England and needed to rest after the journey. Mrs. Neele had been a model guest. She took her meals in the dining room, played piano in the lounge, attended the evening dances, chatted pleasantly with other guests. She seemed perfectly normal and content. Except Bob Tappan had been reading the newspapers about the missing novelist, and he was increasingly convinced that Mrs. Teresa Neele looked exactly like the photographs of Agatha Christie. He contacted the police. They were skeptical. Why would Agatha Christie be calmly staying at a spa hotel under a false name, 200 miles away from where she'd disappeared? But they sent officers to investigate. At the same time, they contacted Archie Christie and suggested he come to Harrogate to potentially identify someone. On the evening of December 14th, Archie arrived at the Hydropathic hotel. He walked into the lounge where guests were having dinner and dancing, and there, sitting at a table, was his wife, Agatha, wearing an evening dress, chatting with other hotel guests as if nothing unusual had happened. She was using the name Teresa Neele. Teresa was her middle name. Neele was, of course, the surname of Archie's mistress. When Archie approached her, accounts differ on exactly what happened. Some witnesses said Agatha seemed confused and didn't immediately recognize him. Some said she seemed surprised but not shocked. The hotel staff said she remained composed. What's certain is that Agatha left the hotel with Archie that night, and the media storm that followed made the initial disappearance look tame. The newspapers went absolutely insane. Mystery novelist found at a Yorkshire spa was the kindest headline. Others were more accusatory. Was it a hoax? Publicity stunt backfires. Famous author wasted police time. The Daily Mail published a scathing editorial suggesting the whole thing had been a calculated publicity stunt and that Agatha should be prosecuted for wasting police resources. Other papers defended her, suggesting she'd had a genuine breakdown or was suffering from amnesia. Two doctors examined Agatha after she was found. They diagnosed her with psychogenic fugue, a rare psychiatric condition where someone, usually after extreme trauma or stress, loses their sense of identity and sometimes wanders away from their normal life. People in a fugue state can function normally, create new identities, and genuinely have no memory of their previous life or how they got where they are. Agatha's family and doctors insisted this was what had happened. She'd been under extreme stress, her mother's death, the grief and exhausting work of clearing out the family home, the shock of Archie's affair and demand for divorce, the final terrible argument. Something in her mind had snapped, and she'd entered a dissociative state. The explanation was medically plausible. Fugue states are real, though rare. The condition was less understood in 1926 than it is now, but doctors recognized it as a genuine psychiatric phenomenon. But the public didn't buy it. Too many things seemed suspicious. She'd packed a suitcase before leaving. She'd checked into a hotel using a false name, specifically a name designed to reference her husband's mistress. She'd functioned perfectly normally for 11 days, chatting with guests, attending dances, even playing piano. That didn't sound like someone who'd lost their memory and identity. Some people suggested it was revenge. Agatha had staged her disappearance to humiliate Archie, to make him look guilty, to punish him for their affair. And she'd checked in under Nancy Neele's name as a deliberate twist of the knife. Others thought it was somewhere between breakdown and revenge. Maybe she'd genuinely been in some kind of altered mental state, but had subconsciously chosen actions that would hurt Archie. Agatha herself said nothing publicly. She released a brief statement through her doctors, saying she'd suffered from amnesia and had no memory of the 11 days. She thanked the police and volunteers who'd searched for her. She apologized for any trouble caused. And then she refused to ever discuss it again. For the remaining 50 years of her life, through hundreds of interviews and public appearances, Agatha Christie never explained what happened during those 11 days. She never clarified whether it was fugue, revenge, breakdown, or something else. When interviewers asked, she changed the subject. When biographers pressed, she'd refuse to cooperate. Even in her autobiography published in 1977 after her death, she completely skipped over the disappearance. The book goes from describing her mother's death and the breakdown of her marriage directly to the aftermath of the divorce, as if those 11 days simply didn't exist. She wrote, "I have to confess that I cannot remember much of what went on during that time. That's it." That's all she ever said about it in her own words. So, what actually happened? After nearly a century, we still don't know for certain, but there are several main theories that historians and biographers have debated. The first is the medical explanation, genuine psychogenic fugue. The stress of her mother's death, the exhausting grief work, the shock of discovering Archie's affair, and the violent final argument could have triggered a dissociative episode. In that state, she could have genuinely lost her identity and created a new one, functioning on autopilot while having no conscious awareness of her previous life. The fact that she chose the name Teresa Neele could have been subconscious. The name was in her mind because of the affair, so it bubbled up when she needed to give a false name. People in fugue states often retain skills in social functioning while losing autobiographical memory. This is medically documented and plausible. The second theory is calculated revenge. Agatha, hurt and humiliated by Archie's affair, decided to punish him by disappearing in a way that would make him look guilty. She left the car at the edge of a quarry to suggest suicide or foul play. She disappeared during a weekend when Archie was with Nancy Neele, ensuring he'd be questioned. She checked into the hotel under Nancy's surname to make it clear what this was about. When she was eventually found, it was a complex, cruel plan to make Archie suffer the way she was suffering. The problem with this theory is that it assumes a level of cold calculation that doesn't match Agatha's personality, as described by people who knew her. The third theory, and perhaps the most likely, is that it was somewhere in between, a genuine breakdown that manifested in ways that also happened to hurt Archie. Agatha was in a state of extreme psychological distress. She wasn't thinking clearly. She did something impulsive and self destructive, but her subconscious mind chose a form of self destruction that would also punish the man who'd hurt her. She genuinely couldn't remember it afterward because trauma can create amnesia, even without full fugue. This theory suggests that human psychology is messier than neat categories, not quite fugue, not quite revenge, but something more complicated. There is also a fourth, darker theory that some biographers have suggested. Agatha was genuinely suicidal that night. She drove to the quarry intending to drive off the edge or drown herself in the silent pool. But at the last moment, she couldn't do it. She abandoned the car and wandered away in a daze. She ended up at the train station, bought a ticket north, and eventually found herself at Harrogate because her mind was looking for a safe place to hide from everything that was hurting her. The amnesia could have been real, traumatic dissociation following an aborted suicide attempt. What we do know for certain is limited to the facts. Agatha disappeared after a traumatic period and a violent argument. She was found 11 days later at a spa hotel under a false name. She claimed amnesia. She never spoke about it again, and she spent the rest of her life carefully controlling her public image and deflecting any questions about that period. The immediate aftermath of the disappearance was brutal for everyone involved. Agatha retreated from public life. She moved into her sister Madge's house to recover. She saw doctors regularly. She dealt with the humiliation of being a national spectacle everywhere in England. Everyone in England had an opinion about what she'd done and why, and most of these opinions weren't kind. The divorce from Archie proceeded. It was finalized in 1928. Archie married Nancy Neele immediately afterward. They stayed married until Nancy's death in 1958, and by all accounts were happy together. Archie died in 1962 and never publicly spoke about Agatha's disappearance beyond his initial statements to police in 1926. Agatha got custody of Rosalind, now 8 years old, and thoroughly confused about what had happened to her mother and why her father had left. Agatha threw herself into being a mother and trying to give Rosalind stability after the chaos. And slowly, carefully, Agatha rebuilt her life and her career. She kept writing, of course. Writing was what she'd always done when life got difficult. She published a new Poirot novel in 1927 and another in 1928. The disappearance had made her more famous, which translated to higher book sales, though the cost had been her privacy and reputation. In 1928, she decided she needed to get away from England and all its memories. She accepted an invitation to visit friends in Baghdad. The journey required taking the Orient Express from London to Istanbul, then continuing by other means to Iraq. On that trip, she met Max Mallowan. Max Mallowan was an archaeologist working on excavations in Iraq. He was 26 years old. Agatha was 38. He was quiet, scholarly, and passionate about Mesopotamian archaeology. She was famous, still raw from her divorce, and trying to figure out how to move forward. They met at an excavation site in Ur. Max was assigned to give Agatha a tour of the dig. They started talking about archaeology, history, travel. Max was intelligent and interesting in a completely different way from Archie. He loved learning, discussing ideas, and sharing his passion for ancient civilizations. Agatha later wrote, I fell in love with archaeology and with Max simultaneously. She'd found something she didn't expect, not just romance, but intellectual partnership and genuine shared interests. Max proposed in 1930. Agatha's friends and family were skeptical. He was 14 years younger, from a completely different world, and they'd known each other less than 2 years. But Agatha said yes. They married in September 1930 in Scotland. It was a quiet ceremony, nothing like the rushed wartime wedding to Archie. This time, Agatha knew what she was doing. The marriage was, by all accounts, genuinely happy. Max and Agatha spent their lives together, traveling to archaeological sites in Syria, Iraq, and Egypt. Agatha would write during the excavation seasons, working in the expedition house while Max directed the digs. She became skilled at cleaning and cataloging pottery finds. She took the photographs that documented the excavations. She was a full partner in his work. She also kept writing detective novels, prolifically. She published roughly 1 or 2 books a year for the next 40 years. She created more iconic mysteries, made Poirot and Miss Marple household names worldwide, and became the best-selling novelist in history. Her personal life remained intensely private. She gave few interviews, she avoided publicity, she never discussed the disappearance or her first marriage. She constructed a careful public persona as a slightly eccentric, grandmotherly mystery writer who lived quietly with her archaeologist husband. When asked about the 1926 disappearance, she'd say something vague about having been unwell, then change the subject. Journalists learned not to push. Her publishers learned not to include it in promotional materials. It became the unspoken rule. You could ask Agatha Christie about Hercule Poirot, about Miss Marple, about her writing process, about archaeology, about anything except those 11 days in December 1926. She wrote her autobiography in 1960s and deliberately omitted the disappearance entirely. The book was published posthumously in 1977, and readers were baffled by the gap. This was a woman who'd made her career explaining mysteries, revealing solutions, providing answers, and she left her own greatest mystery unsolved. Agatha Christie died in 1976 at age 85. She'd written 66 detective novels, 14 short story collections, and the longest running play in theatre history, The Mousetrap, which opened in 1952 and is still running. She'd outsold every other novelist in history except Shakespeare and the Bible. She'd been made Dame Commander of the British Empire. She'd lived to see her characters become cultural icons. And she'd kept the secret until the end. After her death, biographers and researchers have tried to solve the mystery using documents, letters, and interviews with people who knew her. Some of Mac's family's members claimed he told them Agatha had staged the disappearance as revenge against Archie. Some of Agatha's friends said she'd genuinely been in a fugue state. Some psychiatrists analyzing her writing and behavior suggest post-traumatic dissociation. In 2006, 80 years after the disappearance, a letter was discovered that Agatha had written to her husband's brother, Campbell Christie, on the day she disappeared. In it, she wrote that she was going to a spa in Yorkshire for rest. This suggests some level of conscious planning rather than complete fugue. But that still doesn't answer the questions. Why? Why stage a disappearance? Why use Nancy Neele's name? Why stay silent for 11 days while thousands of people searched? Why never explain? Maybe it was genuine amnesia. Maybe it was calculated revenge. Maybe it was a breakdown that manifested as something in between. Maybe she herself didn't fully understand it. Or maybe Agatha Christie, the queen of mystery, simply decided that some mysteries don't need solutions, some stories don't need endings, some questions are better left unanswered. She spent her life proving she was the master of puzzle, the creator of impossible crimes and brilliant solutions, and then she created one final mystery, lived with it for 50 years, and took the solution to her grave. The woman who taught millions of readers that every mystery has an explanation never explained her own. Sleep well, knowing that even the greatest mystery writers keep secrets, and that sometimes the most fascinating stories are the ones that remain unsolved.